So I'm very excited to be here today and share some of our joint presentation about our independent work over the last number of years investigating NSO, and particularly in this talk, we're going to focus on some of the exploits and technical details of what NSO was doing and how they were compromising devices. So you might be wondering who we are. We both work for civil society organizations with the particular goal of investigating targeted attacks against civil society, so it's journalists, activists, some opposition politicians. Our teams have both been doing this work independently for a number of years. Citizen Lab found the first NSO exploit in the wild back in 2016 already. Amnesty's been working on NSO since about 2018, including with the Pegasus project last year. We kind of realized earlier this year that we found a lot of cases, but we haven't really spent the time to dig into some of the technical details and understand exactly what is the history of how these capabilities by NSO have evolved over time. And so we decided it would be a good idea to start comparing some of our notes, look at some of the forensic evidence we have, and see what we can learn from this by taking a different perspective and digging into the technical details and the forensic evidence. I think everyone is here in this room will have known about NSO and have heard of them before. Just to make sure we're on the same page, NSO is an Israeli cyber surveillance company. They make spyware tools that they sell specifically to governments around the world. They say it's for targeting terrorists and criminals, but we'll see that that's really not often the case. On the right-hand side here, we'll see a picture of some of the capabilities. This is from an old brochure from about 6 years ago, and they talk about what they can retrieve from a mobile device. It's basically all of the data, like SMS, email, turning on the mic. And just to make it a bit more personal, the actual name NSO comes from the initials of the three co-founders. So people still involved in the company are the guy here on the far left, is Shalav Julio, and the person at the far right, Omri Lavi. Shalav Julio is the longtime CEO, and he's an interesting character. We might come back to him later. So I think what NSO is most famous for is not their technology, but actually how often they're getting caught and how often their spyware has been found on the devices of journalists and activists and illegitimate targets around the world. Here's just some of the cases that ourselves at Amnesty and also Citizen Lab have found over the last number of years. In this talk, we're not really going to focus on the individual cases. We've talked about these elsewhere. Instead, we're going to look at more in the technical evidence and technical information. So let Bill go ahead with what are zero clicks.
Yeah, thanks, Donncha, and it's great to be here. This is my first virus bulletin, so very excited to be talking. So you've probably all heard of this term zero-click or zero-click exploit, and a lot of the exploits, in fact, pretty much all of them that we're going to be discussing today are zero-click exploits. So what is the precise definition that we're using here? What exactly is a zero-click? Well, the way that we define zero-clicks for the purpose of this talk are exploits which are both remote and interactionless. So what do we mean by remote? Well, we mean that there is no privileged vantage point, no special access to the target. This can really be deployed essentially from anywhere in the world against the target. So things like attacks where you're screwing with the person's internet connection, like packet injection or man-in-the-middle attacks, or obviously physical access to the device, even though those don't involve the victim interacting with anything to become infected, these do not qualify as zero clicks by our definition because they're not remote. And similarly, the attack has to be interactionless. So things like clicking on a link in an SMS to become infected, installing an app, accepting an invite, these are things which, obviously involve more than zero clicks, which is where the term comes from. So back in the quote-unquote good old days of 2001, zero-click attacks were actually not super hard in many cases to carry out, because there was this great standard from the perspective of attackers called WAP, which I guess is what Wireless Application Protocol. It's so old I don't even know what it stands for, but it stands for something like that. And there were provisions within the WAP standard to be able to push messages at phones, and then the phone would take a certain action based on the type of message that was pushed. So in particular, I'm not sure if you can read that in the back, but basically there was a type of message called a service loading message, and there were various parameters that you could pass through this message. So the service loading message would instruct the phone that received it to open a URL. And I guess you could specify this execute low action, which the standard says, opening the URL in a browser must be carried out in a non-user intrusive manner. which is sort of an interesting way to kind of get a free zero-click exploit if you have access to the sort of massive buffet of browser exploits which are constantly being found out there. So kind of a nice way to convert a browser exploit, which might ordinarily require the victim to click on a link, into this sort of remotely deployable zero-click exploit. Fortunately, nowadays, this WAP has gone by the wayside. And if you actually want a true zero-click exploit, you need to work just a little bit harder than finding a browser exploit. So the first indications that we started seeing in media reporting and other sources that there were this sort of new generation of zero-click exploits being deployed came around 2017. There were some reports about Pegasus 3, which was the successor to Pegasus 2, which is NSO Group's flagship spyware product. And reports said, well, this is so sophisticated, the target doesn't even need to click on a link. It was sold reportedly to the Saudis for $55 million, so not necessarily a cheap thing to buy. And in 2019 was sort of the first concrete technical evidence that these zero clicks were being exploited. So there was a famous case, the WhatsApp case, the WhatsApp missed call hack, where WhatsApp was able to detect that there was active exploitation of a vulnerability in the WhatsApp call stack going on. And they were able to, in a 2-week period between April and May 2019, they were able to identify, based on their systems, their telemetry, 1,400 mobile phones were targeted with this exploit. And it was CVE 2019 3568. They issued a patch. And this was sort of the first concrete technical evidence, hey, these zero clicks are out there. The attack obviously didn't require picking up the call. This was just a buffer overflow in the crypto negotiation that rather unfortunately happened before the call was picked up by the victim. Of course, there was also a very famous report from Reuters in 2019 about how UAE used this exploit called Karma to spy on activists, foreign governments, dissidents, journalists, et cetera, in 2016 and 2017. And then, of course, last year in 2021, there was the famous case of this exploit, which was captured. It was the first zero-click iMessage exploit. We were actually able to recover it from a victim phone. This was a Pegasus exploit. Essentially, there was a bug in iMessage that we'll talk about a little bit later, dealing with processing of certain types of attachments. And I'll hand it back over to my co-speaker, Donncha, to talk a little bit about the title of the talk, Exploit Archaeology. How are we finding these exploits from forensic analysis, and what is the process there?
Thanks. So as you can imagine, we started talking a little bit about zero clicks, and we started investigating zero clicks because of some of these media articles. We're realizing this is something that's being deployed in the wild, and we started to realize, okay, we need to investigate this, because this is actually quite a different approach than what we're using before. Typically, we would rely on journalists or activists coming to us being like, I got this weird SMS message, I got this weird link, or a weird email. They would come to us with this evidence, we would check it and try to investigate that. So when we started to realize that zero clicks might be deployed, we needed to realize, okay, the individual is not going to detect it themselves. Instead, we need to be more proactive, and we need to go and start finding ways to detect this on a device, even where the user does not notice it themselves. So how we do this is we start collecting some forensic data from a device. On iPhones, this is actually quite straightforward. A lot of information is included in an iPhone backup. So we'll create an iPhone backup of the phone, and then we'll write parsers for different databases on the system. So it might be for SMS databases, iMessage databases, other system log files. And then we'd start looking for known indicators of compromise on this phone. So for example, maybe we'd look for a known Pegasus domain that we have previously identified. Then we'll see, okay, is there any suspicious processes on the phone shortly after that link is opened? And then we'll know that process name, for example, is a Pegasus-related process. And then we'll kind of do the process in reverse. So instead, we'll go and look at maybe a different phone, see this Pegasus process showing up on the device, and then try to look around at the same time on that phone and figure out how did that actual Pegasus installation get on the device. So maybe that they opened a link, or maybe that they shortly beforehand received an iMessage message. And through this kind of process of chaining over time, we can start understanding here's known malicious behavior, and then try to figure out how exactly that reached the device. So you can do this manually. Also, you can use tools like MVT, which helps automate some of this process of extracting the data and creating timelines that you can then use to look for this kind of suspicious behavior and try to understand how exactly it got to the phone. So now we're going to get into the meat of the talk. We're going to go through some of the exploits that we have seen being used in the wild and talk a little bit about how widely they're used and why we suspect they were exploiting the phones. So the first one we have is this vulnerability here. It's actually called Golden Gate, like the Golden Gate Bridge. So this was the earliest zero-click exploit we saw used in the wild, all the way back in iOS 10. So remember, this is already like 2 years before the WhatsApp hacks. This is really early, before there's really any public knowledge about zero clicks being used. So in this case, we saw it being used against a few targets successfully. It affected some versions of iOS 10, and we believe it happened, or it was exploiting the phone somehow over iMessage. So you may be wondering, how do we know this? So we actually know this based on one quite key file that we were able to find on iPhones, and it's called the ID status cache file. So you can see the full title here. It's com apple ID services, ID status cache.plist. And so what this file is basically a cache of all those different Apple accounts that have interacted with that particular phone. So for example, if you send someone iMessage, or you FaceTime them, or maybe even airdrop them something, this file will keep a record of which other Apple account was interacting with your phone. So what we did is we looked at these devices that were compromised by Golden Gate, had this Golden Gate process, and then we see around the same time, maybe a little bit beforehand, a little bit afterwards, we see that a malicious attacker-controlled Apple account is on the phone, and we see that it's related to iMessage. And so we saw this on a number of phones, so you could say, okay, quite clearly this Apple account is delivering this vulnerability over iMessage. So this is a little bit of what the timeline looks like. We see a crash reporter file drop, the process starts, another Pegasus process starts, PCSD, and this is what it looks like on the phone. We also see the email address is not on this table. So the next one we're going to look at is called, it's called the Thumper exploit. So this was the next version of iOS, for iOS 11. It was targeted quite broadly from January 2018 until December 2018. In this case, what's interesting is that it actually wasn't an iMessage exploit, as far as you can tell. And instead, when we look at the ID status cache file, we see lookups with a malicious Pegasus-linked email address, but this time for the com apple Thumper service. So I don't think anyone will know what this is, but com apple Thumper is actually the internal Apple name for a feature called Voice over Wi-Fi. It's some kind of handoff feature to let you have phone calls over the Wi-Fi network instead of your mobile operator. So we don't know exactly how this exploit operated. We don't have many cases of this, but we do know that this service was somehow used by NSO, by their customers, to try and deliver this exploit successfully on the phone. So it's seen in quite a few countries, in Hungary, India, and Morocco. And so we know it happened, we just don't know exactly how it was being used. I think where we really see iMessage exploits and zero clicks kick off is this with vulnerability in iOS 12. So we call it the role account D exploit. Again, it was exploited very broadly. I think from our own investigations, we found at least dozens with forensic confirmation, but it's probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of devices that were compromised with this. It's really, really extensive. It was earliest exploited in iOS 12.1.4, and we know this again with iMessage. But what's really interesting about this particular exploit is how the attackers succeeded in getting full code execution on the device. So what we suspect about zero clicks is that it's a much more difficult environment to compromise the device. You don't have a JavaScript running, you don't have all these other nice features that help you calculate the offsets and calculate the memory. You really just get one shot to send the payload and then hope you get successful. So what we suspect happened here is that NSO is just using the zero click, kind of like what the WAP push was doing, simply to get the initial code execution and then pivot from the iMessage to a WebKit instance, open a WebKit instance, which we saw here. The Pegasus zero click opened Apple Music, loaded this URL at the bottom, which is a known Pegasus exploit domain, and from loading this HTML or JavaScript, they're able to run a regular kind of browser exploit on the phone and then proceed to exploit the phone. So this is quite interesting, and we'll see this pattern going through the subsequent exploits where they try and go from this constrained environment to a full WebKit environment. So I guess one question we want to know is like, how severe is the risk of zero-click vulnerabilities? So we've created a metric which we call the observed update deficit. And what this is trying to capture is what risk is there to a user who's always on the latest version of iOS. And so because we have quite a number of cases of this, we're able to calculate, so when was the first time we saw a particular version exploited, and how long is it before the next version of iOS is released. And so for this particular exploit, we see there was 75 days in 2019 where a user who was very security cautious, was always on the latest version of iOS, could have theoretically been compromised using this NSO Group iMessage exploit and zero click, and there's very little they could have done about it at the time. So we see this is being exploited really widely all the way until August 2019. So then what happened? Why did it stop? It seems like it was a good exploit, it was very reliable, and so that's also an interesting story. So we're going to go back to some other research that Google Project Zero released back in 2019. And so they were also looking at some of these media reports, some of these talk about iMessage zero clicks. And what they decided to do was to do their own research and figure out, thinking like an attacker, can they create their own zero-click exploit targeting an iPhone? So in this research, they talk about checking different attack surfaces, and they also kind of realized that iMessage seems the most promising place to look at. When they looked at the iMessage, they realized there were some problems with how iMessage was deserializing particular classes sent over iMessage, and they could kind of abuse this to deserialize some child classes and use this to take control of the phone, basically. So they reported this to Apple in the summer of 2019, and we see here a tweet from Samuel Gross, where he says that in iOS 12.4.1, Apple deployed a mitigation which didn't completely fix the deserialization bug, but at least it made it unreachable in iMessage. And so this was it basically stops the iPhone from unserializing child classes. So what's really interesting is that this version where they patch it in iOS 12.4.1 is also the same version where this particular vulnerability stops being deployed. So what we believe from this is it's quite likely that Project Zero figured out that this particular attack surface was likely to be used, and they actually managed to fix an attack surface that was actively being exploited by NSO Group and maybe other threat actors in the wild, and patched this vulnerability that was being used in like real time to target civil society around the world. So this is like a really positive outcome of kind of independent security research and offensive security research. Let's go.
So this brings us to the next vulnerabilities. We've seen iOS 10, iOS 11, iOS 12, and the iOS 12, the role account de-exploit stopped working, as Donncha said, right when Apple was able to mitigate the issue that Google Project Zero disclosed. However, while they were able to mitigate the issue, in other words, render the code unreachable through iMessage, we heard that Apple didn't fully fix the issue OS-wide until iOS 13.2. And perhaps interestingly, we see another exploit deployed against iOS 13, but only against a single version. And that exploit stops working in 13.2, which is when Apple mitigated the issue or resolved the issue OS-wide. So the potential thing that this suggests is that potentially the attack surface that Google Project Zero identified, so that was closed for iMessage, which NSO might have been exploiting in iOS 12, and then NSO might have found a different way to get at that same attack surface through a different service. In this case, Calm Apple Private Alloy Photo Stream, which is not iMessage. It's, I guess, a separate service for doing like photo sharing and shared albums and that sort of stuff. So potentially another indication that what Google Project Zero found was actually being used by NSO in the wild. And just like the iOS 12 exploit, this iOS 13 exploit had the pivot to WebKit. So on devices that were targeted or infected with this exploit, we were able to recover files from the cache which showed that WebKit instances had been opened and JavaScript. Unfortunately, there was no exploit saved in the cache, but JavaScript that would then download an exploit was saved in the cache. Unfortunately, as we recovered it, years or months after the fact, we couldn't actually get the juicy full contents of the exploit. But you can see we're getting like a little bit closer here. So, I forgot to set up the joke here. So sorry about that. Basically, this period. So basically, we had the iOS 12 exploit, which was burned, the iOS 13 exploit, which was burned very quickly. And then there was a period of about 8 months where we don't see any zero clicks being deployed against the latest versions of iOS. So you might call this the Great Zero Click Winter. It's the largest period of time that we've identified where there was no active zero click against the latest iOS versions. However, they were still going ham on the old iOS versions. So you might call this the Great Zero Click Winter. I've very cleverly interposed Shalev Julio, the CEO of NSO, or former CEO of NSO's photo on the head of a Game of Thrones character here, which I wish I had set up better on the last slide. But anyway, so we have the Great Zero Click Winter, right? The attack surface that NSO has been fishing out of looks to have been closed by Project Zero and Apple's patch. So what do they have to do? They have to find a new attack surface to go after. So it looks like they did. And around July 2010, we started seeing them pivot to a new attack surface, IAM Transcoder Agent. So no longer are they fishing off of this deserializing child classes issue that has been fixed in 13.2. They're now looking at a new attack target. So around 5th of July 2020, we saw examples of this compromise beginning to happen. And we saw in the system logs for the compromised phones, the first thing was like, a preview was being generated and there was some error. Okay, that seems pretty suspicious. But the next thing, the thing that really sealed the deal as this being the vector, is we see that as IAM transcoder agent is generating this preview, somehow it launches a WebKit instance. And this is really bad, because we know that there's sort of an infinite supply of WebKit exploits out there that they can be drawing from, and they can use this to compromise the device via the pivot to WebKit technique. So indeed, that's what we saw in the next log file element. We saw that this WebKit process launched by IAM transcoder agent was downloading about 500 kilobytes, which is the size of sort of the first stage payload of Pegasus from this Pegasus installation server. Now, one of the interesting things here is, again, this exploit was wound up and patched pretty quickly. We didn't actually get the full code of the exploit, but it seems that a mitigation that Apple introduced in iOS 14 called Blast Door prevented the exploit from working against iOS 14. So this was only deployed as a 0-day for 14 days against 13.5.1 and 13.7, with a notable absence of 13.6. I don't think that's because we're missing data. I think it's just because, for whatever reason, there was something different about 13.6, or they didn't want to deploy it against 13.6 for whatever reason. Anyway, as I mentioned, Blast Door was the Apple mitigation that was introduced that fixed this. Blast Door introduced some additional sandboxing around preview generation for IAM transcoder agent. So you can see here Apple CEO Tim Cook laughing, but it turns out that it was, in fact, Shalev Julio who had the last laugh on IAM transcoder agent. So it looks like we saw in the beginning of 2021 some compromises that looked like potentially Pegasus was somehow breaking through Blast Door. And what was going on? Well, we dug in a little bit further, and we were able to identify, both from capturing the exploit and sharing with Google Project Zero and Apple, they did some great analyses that they published on this, what was the root cause here. So it turns out that iMessage, like many messaging platforms, loves animated GIFs, right? And they want to make animated GIFs loop forever. Some animated GIFs have a loop counter field which is set to like 1 or 2, so the GIF will show 1 or 2 times and then it'll stop being animated. But you don't want that. You want it to always be animated, always be looping, so in case someone reads the message later, they'll still see the animation. So how do you make a GIF loop forever? Well, the way that iMessage did it was they copied the animated GIF, made a copy of it, edited the loop counter field in the copy, and then displayed the edited GIF to the user so that they would see the infinite animation. So, okay, step one, copy the animated GIF. So they use this function that sounds pretty innocuous, right? Copy GIF from path to destination, right? It's just going to copy the GIF, no issue there. Actually, there was a problem. So this function is misleadingly named. It does way more than just copy a GIF file. In fact, it parsed the image outside of Blast Door. It used the full image IO stack comprising 20 formats against anything with a .gif extension. So if you're an attacker and you find just like one crufty old image standard that has some bug in it, you can just name it as .gif, send it to the victim phone, and it'll process it outside of Blast Door. So at this point, the phone gets pwned. In actuality, they're not breaking through Blast Door, as is common in security. When you come up with a new mitigation, new security feature, there's probably some way to get around it, because there's probably some old code path you forgot about or something that your expectation doesn't match the reality. So after the exploit achieved code execution, it then had to do stuff, because it's in this sort of limited iMessage sandbox. So what did it do? Well, it chained together some NS expressions that downloaded the next stage and decrypted it with an AES key, which was randomized, unfortunately, per attempt. So if you get like one bit of the exploit chain from one attempt, you can't necessarily decrypt it unless you have the full chain. So it prevents us from seeing, what was the whole chain that was being used. We just got the sort of first parts. And this entry, this exploit is of course referred to as forced entry and also Megalodon. You can see highlighted here in the example of the URL that was fetched from CloudFront, Amazon CloudFront. So Amazon eventually found out about this and shut it down. This exploit was enormously successful on our observed update deficit metric, 131 days in 2021, that you were vulnerable even if you were mashing that update button, staying on the latest version of iOS. Apple, nicely enough, sent out a notification. Because this exploit was delivered via iMessage, they were able to see who was targeted, and there were targets in about 150 countries. So I'll hand it back over to Donncha to mention the one Android exploit that we have details on.
So I know we don't have much time left, so I'll try to be quick here. So we looked a lot of iMessage and iOS exploits. That's not to say that there isn't exploits and zero clicks on Android. It's just we have a lot less visibility on Android for some technical reasons. So thinking back to this piece from WhatsApp. So they said they found 1,400 targets being targeted in just 2 weeks in April and May 2019. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look and see if we could actually find some cases of this exploit being targeted maybe outside of this range. And so what we did is we looked at some of the Android targets we had worked with previously that we identified through the Pegasus project. Many of these had already received one-click links, SMSs, text messages. So we tried to find, was there anything on these phones that could link to the WhatsApp exploit? And on one phone, we found some particularly interesting files. So you'll see here, this person's number was interested in the Pegasus project data. And then a few seconds later, maybe a minute later, they started getting some calls from this unknown number. And then what's really interesting is about a minute later, a crash happens in WhatsApp. Again, they start getting some more calls, and later there's a crash, this time specifically in the WhatsApp voice over IP calling thread. So if you remember what Bill's description earlier, this was the same area of code that was involved in establishing the call crypto that WhatsApp found a vulnerability in. What's really interesting to see is that this particular crash files were from already in July 2018. So this is 10 months before WhatsApp discovered the vulnerability. It seems almost certain that, or quite likely that this person was being targeted by an NSO Group customer and has their phone exploited with this vulnerability. If we look back at the slides at the core documents from WhatsApp, we'll see that they mentioned that a number of accounts were generated by NSO from January 2018 till May 2019 to help deliver these exploits. And they even mentioned some of the countries that were used to register the accounts. So the first on the list is Cyprus, Israel, Brazil. And if we look at this phone number that appeared in the crash logs, we see specifically that this phone number is also from Cyprus. So this is quite concerning because we saw that WhatsApp said they had found 1,400 targets in just 2 weeks, and now we see that this exploit is actually being targeted for 10 months. So there's the potential scale of people who are victims of this is much bigger. So I'm not going to get into this, but we can see a bit more about this in our paper, and please do read the paper. There's a lot of more interesting information there. So here's just a summary of some of these exploits. So basically, every major version of iOS, NSO has fielded some capability, or maybe multiple zero-click capabilities that could target those phones. We also see that they had a quite long-lived Android WhatsApp vulnerability that their clients were able to use to target Android phones. And again, this is all the technical information. We shouldn't forget that all of these cases, all of this evidence was all found on the phones of journalists, activists, people who really should not be legitimately targeted with these kinds of tools. And so we also shouldn't forget the scale of the problem and the personal cost people are being targeted with this stuff.
And I will really quickly conclude here before our time runs out. So just to reemphasize what Donncha was saying earlier about Google Project Zero, their sort of clean room implementation of a zero-click wound up colliding with a real-world attack surface, suggesting that the potential size of a zero-click attack surface is small. So a good offensive strategy that focuses on trying to replicate attacker capabilities in the lab can collide with attacker capabilities and provide good defense. So more efforts like this are quite useful. Speaking of things that would be useful, also, you might have heard Apple's iOS 16 feature of lockdown mode. And of course, Google for a long time has had advanced protection. These sorts of modes, which are designed to be enabled by activists who are essentially saying, give me fewer features and more security. So we need, I think, more companies looking into options like this, as well as user studies that examine how well these options work with activists and dissident workflows. And also, back to this issue of notifications. Notifications are a great example of a way that industry and civil society groups and researchers like Bill and Donncha, like us, can potentially collaborate to help bring better security to users around the world. We can hunt for months and months and months, checking thousands of phones and find nothing, but all of a sudden notifications go out and we know who to dig deeper on. So that can be really helpful in terms of understanding these capabilities. And with that, I would like to say thank you, and please reach out to us during the coffee breaks or at the happy hour, and we'll be happy to chat more.
Yeah, thank you, Donncha and Bill.